Welcome to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, the show that delves into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the worlds of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we've got you covered.
Welcome to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Virginia Lucci, coming at you live from my house in beautiful, sunny Montgomery, Alabama. I have a great show for you today. First off, we're going to discuss the president's diagnosis of COVID and what that means to the rest of the country. We're going to take a look at what caused the economic downturn in the early spring. Then we're going to talk about what's going on for the recovery. And stick around to the end of the show, and we're going to go over the top 10 Halloween candies. So I'm sure you're not going to want to miss that. Before we get started, I want to give you my normal disclaimer. The show is for entertainment purposes only. If you have any questions regarding legal advice, tax advice, or financial advice, see a local attorney, tax advisor, or financial planner for advice that's tailored to your needs. Now, let's get to it. The biggest news of the week is easily that the president has tested positive for coronavirus, which was announced late on Thursday morning. He was transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center on Friday afternoon, and he was given the antiviral drug remdesivir. The president also took a short motorcade ride to wave to his supporters standing outside the hospital. Early Monday morning, Trump fired off a series of tweets urging Americans to vote for him, citing the biggest tax cut ever and stock market highs. Doctors and White House staff offered conflicting assessments of Trump's condition over the weekend, but on Sunday said the president had seen improvement. Trump briefly left Walter Reed Medical Center to ride by and wave at supporters gathered outside the hospital. It is my understanding that immediately after I'm recording this podcast that he is going to be released from the hospital, so I'll have more information on that during my next podcast, and we'll bring any updates as needed. U.S. stocks climbed Monday as investors grew more hopeful that lawmakers would reach a compromise on a new stimulus deal in light of President Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis and signs of a slowdown in economic recovery. Monday's gains also came amid indications of an improvement in Trump's health and the prospect that he may be leaving the hospital soon. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed 350 points, or 1.3%. The S&P 500 also rose 1.3%, while the NASDAQ gained 1.7%. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin held an hour-long phone call on Monday and discussed the justifications for various numbers and plan to exchange paper in preparations for further discussions on Tuesday. Optimism for reaching a compromise rose recently after Pelosi said Trump's diagnosis could change the dynamic of talks towards an agreement. Pelosi on Friday called on the airline industry to delay furloughs, saying additional relief for the industry is imminent. The pair expects to talk again on Tuesday as the White House and the Democratic leaders try to craft an elusive pandemic relief package. Pelosi spokesman Drew Hamill said in a tweet, Pelosi and Mnuchin plan to exchange more details about their proposals on Monday. The sides have made a final push in the recent days to strike an aid agreement and pass legislation before the November 3rd election. While Pelosi and Mnuchin seem to have made progress towards a deal, they had a range of outstanding disagreements heading into the weekend. The millions of Americans still out of work during the pandemic await more relief from Washington after several financial lifelines set up during the outbreak expired weeks ago. Economists have worried that a lack of new financial stimulus will stunt a slowing U.S. economic recovery. And we're going to get into a deep dive into this in my later segment, so just stay tuned. Lawmakers also aim to bolster efforts to test Americans for the virus, treat COVID-19, and develop an effective vaccine, as the country still reports tens of thousands of new cases per day. The president also put pressure on Congress over the weekend to get a deal done, saying in a tweet that lawmakers should, quote, work together and get it done. While at Walter Reed, the president has been treated with Regeneron. He was given an 8-gram dose of Regeneron's monoclonal antibody treatment, his doctor said. Researchers are using Regeneron's experimental antibody drug in a very different way. They're giving it to patients with only mild symptoms. Many experts view the drug as the best bet to stymie the coronavirus and transform it from a potentially lethal disease to a treatable illness. This drug, called a monoclonal antibody cocktail, aims to keep people out of the hospital altogether. The experimental shot of lab-generated antibodies imitates the body's own disease-fighting force. The goal is to boost a person's immune defense instead of waiting for human biology to muster its own response and possibly lose to the virus. Just last week, Regeneron announced its drug appeared to be effective against the virus. So the president has taken a drug that was only deemed successful last week. And last month, Eli Lilly announced interim data that its monoclonal antibodies seem to reduce hospitalizations when given to people, although the data haven't been peer-reviewed. At the same time, this is going to create a very difficult situation for the drug maker since it hasn't been cleared for broader use. According to its own CEO, Dr. Leonard Schleifer, in words to CNBC on Monday, the company said it provided the drug to the president in response to a, quote, compassionate use request from Trump's doctors, which allows for expanded access to experimental drugs for immediately life-threatening illnesses, according to the Food and Drug Administration. It allows patients to access an investigational drug outside of clinical trials in lieu of adequate other treatments. That means that while the president's doctors were confident enough of the drug's benefit to administer it to Trump, the treatment remains unavailable to most Americans. We have tried to take a principled approach until there's a broader authorization, Schleifer told CNBC's Meg Terrell on Squawk Box on Monday morning. Asking somebody like the president to go into a clinical trial just wasn't practical. Until the FDA takes a look at all available data on the benefits and risk of the drug for COVID-19 patients, patients who want to receive the treatment should enroll in a clinical trial. Dr. Schaefer added that patients in clinical trials are closely monitored so that researchers can understand how the drug affects the disease, but at least a third of the patients will receive a placebo. Giving it to Trump or to others who might not be able to or don't qualify for clinical trials is the right use of compassionate use. That's for small numbers of people for these exceptions. We want everybody to potentially be able to benefit. We understand we don't make that decision, but that decision is for the FDA to make. Schleifer added that he thinks the treatment meets a lot of the FDA standards for an emergency authorization, but he said the company needs to continue to collect data and control clinical trials to better understand the treatment. But as the trials continue, the virus continues to infect more than 40,000 people every day across the country. Some analysts have speculated that the use of Regeneron's antibody cocktail to treat the president is a tacit endorsement of the drug and could signal swift approval by the FDA. Schleifer tried to assure the public in his CNBC interview that the FDA does have its own standards and the White House does not play a role. However, shares of the company were up more than 5% in early trading on Mondays. President Donald Trump previously reported he earned capital gains from Regeneron Pharmaceuticals and Gilead Services Incorporated, the manufacturers of two of the medicines he's taken as part of his COVID-19 treatment plan. According to a 2017 financial disclosure form filled by the U.S. Office of Government Ethics in June 2017, Trump had a capital gain of $50,001 to $100,000 for Regeneron Pharmaceuticals and of $100,001 to $1 million for Gilead Sciences, Inc. The form notes the information was valid as of April 15, 2017. Trump's subsequent disclosure forms, including his 2020 form, signed on July 31st, did not list Regeneron or Gilead. Trump is also taking Gilead's remdesivir, and I want to say that wrong every time I look at that word, remdesivir, which has been authorized for COVID-19 patients by the FDA under an emergency use declaration. Trials showed effectiveness under some circumstances. Remdesivir received a guarded endorsement in April from Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health, when it was announced as a new tool in the fight against the virus at a presidential news conference. So is this a statement by the president? Well, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, Trump's former FDA commissioner, told CBS last week that he wouldn't infer anything from the fact that they chose Regeneron products over any other products. So if you've studied any history, you know that this isn't the first time that a U.S. president has been seriously ill. I mean, Woodrow Wilson had the Spanish flu, which is the 20th century equivalent of the coronavirus. President Reagan was shot while in office. And in both of these instances, and many more, the economy didn't shut down. To be fair, I'm pretty shocked that the markets were stable today on Monday, but I really shouldn't be. A look back over the past 101 years shows investors have usually been quick to shrug off bouts of even serious illnesses and death when it comes to U.S. presidents. Chief investment strategist at CFRA, Sam Stovall, observed that the deaths of President Harding, Roosevelt, and Kennedy, along with many other presidential medical surprises, resulted in declines of 3% or less for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And 1.2% of that lasted just a few days. Only Dwight Eisenhower's heart attack in 1955 and diagnosis of Crohn's disease in 1956 were greeted by declines in excess of 5% that lasted multiple months, he said. So I guess maybe the president's diagnosis, it isn't as much of an economic crisis as it is just a political crisis, and we're able to move forward. I do think that there is a little bit of a thumb on the scale with some of these medications that the president is taking. And I have some other opinions that this probably isn't the forum for it, but I wish the president well, and hopefully he'll make a full recovery. So with that, before I say too much, I'm going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to take a deep dive into the coronavirus-inspired recession and what's going on with a possible recovery. And if you stick around to the end of the show, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a very serious top 10. What are the top 10 Halloween candies? So stick around.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
welcome back. In our last segment, we talked about how the president's health is affecting markets, and it's really not. But in this segment, we're going to take a look at how the pandemic has affected the economy as a whole and what kind of recession recovery we've got. So I want to get into it. And in the last few episodes, I've thrown out a lot of words like recession, V-shaped recovery, K-shaped recovery, tech bubble, and job crisis. So what does it all mean, and where are we now? So let's take a look back, all the way back to late February, early March of 2020. And if you're like me, that seems like an era ago, but really it was just about 8 months. The COVID recession is a major ongoing global economic crisis, which has caused both a recession in some nations and in others a depression. It's currently the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression. The economic crisis began due to the economic consequences of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The first major signs of the recession was the collapse of markets during the 2020 stock market crash, which began in late February and lasted through March. As of October of 2020, every advanced economy is in a recession or depression, whilst all emerging economies are in a recession. Modeling by the World Bank suggests that in some regions, a full recovery will not be achieved until 2025 or beyond. The COVID pandemic has led to more than a third of the world's population being placed on lockdown to stop the spread of COVID-19. It has caused severe repercussions for economies across the world, following soon after a global economic slowdown during 2019 that saw a stagnation of stock markets and consumer activity worldwide. As we went indoors, the economy suffered. While stay-at-home orders clearly affect many types of businesses, especially those that provide in-person services, including retail stores, restaurants and hotels, entertainment venues and museums, medical offices, and beauty salons and spas, government orders are not the sole pressure on those businesses. In the United States, people began to change their economic behavior 10 to 20 days before their local governments declared stay-at-home orders. And by May, changes in individuals' rates of movement, according to smartphone data, did not always correlate with local laws. Like, for instance, I've been getting my hair done, but I won't go back to the nail salon, and I rarely eat out at a restaurant anymore. And this is 8 months after lockdowns began. The global stock market crash began on February 20th, although the economic aspects of the crisis began to materialize in late 2019. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, global markets, banks, and businesses were all facing crises not seen since the Great Depression in 1929. From February 24th to 28th, stock markets worldwide reported their largest one-week decline since the 2008 financial crisis, but then entered a correction. So we thought things were going okay, right? But then March 9th happened. Prior to the opening that day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average Futures Market experienced a 1,300-point drop based on the pandemic and fall in oil prices, triggering a trading curve or a circuit breaker that caused the futures market to suspend trading for 15 minutes. When the market opened on that day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 1,800 points on opening, 500 points lower than the prediction. The U.S. Dow Jones Industrial Average in total lost more than 2,000 points, described by the News International as the biggest ever fall in intraday trading. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had a number of trading circuit breakers to curb panicked selling. Oil firms Chevron and ExxonMobil fell about 15%. The NASDAQ composite also lost over 620 points. The S&P fell by 7.6%. Oil prices as a whole fell 22%, and the yields on 10-year and 30-year U.S. Treasury securities fell below 0.4% and 0.102% respectively. Canada's S&P Composite Index finished the day off more than 10% lower. Brazil's market gave up 12%, erasing over 15 months of gain for the index. Australia's ASX 200 lost 7.3%, their biggest drop since 2008, even though it rebounded a little bit the next day. London's FTSE 100 lost 7.7%, suffering its worst drop since 2008. BP and Shell experienced intraday price drops of nearly 20%. The FTSE, MIB, CAC 40, and DAX all tanked, with Italy affected the most as the COVID-19 pandemic in the country continued. So what we're really saying is that the entire world experienced a financial crisis. Even in Asia, Japan, Singapore, and the Philippines and Indonesia, shares declined 20% from their most recent peaks. Former George W. Bush administration energy policy advisor Bob McNally noted that was the first time since 1930 and 1931 that a massive negative demand shock has coincided with a supply shock. In the previous case, it was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, precipitating a collapse in international trade during the Great Depression, coinciding with the discovery of the East Texas oil field during the Texas oil boom. The Washington Post posited that the pandemic-related turmoil could spark a collapse of the corporate debt bubble and a worsening recession. So the biggest problem that we experienced on the first wave of this was that our factories were closing. So how do we stay economically relevant when we can't produce goods? And then we had the perfect storm because of the oil issue. Just a few days later, on March 12th, Black Thursday happened. It was a global stock market crash again, and a part of the greater 2020 crash. U.S. stock markets suffered their greatest single-day percentage fall since 1987. Following Black Monday, 3 days earlier, Black Thursday was attributed to the COVID pandemic and a lack of investor confidence in President Trump after he declared a 30-day travel ban against the Schengen area. Additionally, the European Central Bank, under the lead of Christine Lagarde, decided not to cut interest rates despite market expectations, leading to a drop in S&P 500 futures of more than 200 points in less than an hour. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed down an additional 10%, eclipsing the one-day record set on March 9th. The NASDAQ Composite was down 9.4%, and the S&P was down 9.5%. And declines activated the trading curb at the New York Stock Exchange for the second time that week. Oil prices dropped by 8%, while yields on the 10 and 30-year Treasury securities increased to 0.86% and 1.45%, respectively. So things were looking grim. And then we had Black Monday Part 2 on the 16th. Stock futures dropped sharply on Sunday, March 15th in the evening after the Fed surprised markets and cut short-term interest rates to zero and launched a fresh round of crisis-era bond purchases, an emergency move to combat the economic shocks from the coronavirus pandemic, some of which are still going on right now. Dow futures tumbled more than 1,000 points, and the S&P 500 futures dropped 5%, triggering another automatic shock absorber. The losses came after the central bank lowered the Fed's benchmark federal funds rate by a full percentage point to a range of 0 or 2.25%. The market is likely taking this as a panic since the Fed couldn't wait until their meeting that was supposed to have happened on Wednesday. So that really freaked a lot of people out. Dow futures tumbled more than 1,000 points, and the S&P 500 futures dropped 5 points, triggering another circuit breaker. The major averages fell to their lows into the close after the president said that the worst of the outbreak could last until August. Well, little did we know we were so innocent back then. He told reporters that the U.S. may be heading into a recession. So these losses put the Dow down 31.7% from its all-time high, and the S&P 500 and NASDAQ more than 29% below their records from February. The Dow also fell to its lowest point since 2017. Oil prices were also a factor, and they slid 10% on that Monday as the acceleration in coronavirus cases worldwide brought travel to a halt and businesses to a standstill. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude dropped $3.03, or 9.5%, to settle at $28.70 per barrel. Earlier in the session, WTI fell to a session low of $28.03 per barrel. International benchmark Brent crude fell 11.2%, or $3.80, to settle at $30.05 per barrel. Earlier, it traded as low as $29.52 a barrel, its lowest level since January of 2016. So in early March, the stock market's going crazy. And if you recall, people were staying home from work. Before the pandemic hit, unemployment rates were pretty good. I mean, there were only about 6 million people unemployed in the United States at the time. But after the pandemic became more widespread, that number skyrocketed. The unemployment rate in April was the highest it had been since the Great Depression. Through the summer, unemployment slowly but steadily improved as people returned to work. But while the September jobs report showed continued gains, there's still about twice as many people out of work now than before the pandemic. Overall, even if you exclude the sectors directly affected by the pandemic, like air transportation, arts and entertainment, hotels, and both private and public education, the number of jobs in America was 4.6% lower in September than it was in February. So that's just the jobs that are available. That's not far from the 5.3% contraction in total employment that took place during the entire 18 months. So for 18 months prior, there was a 5.6% contraction. So the job market is a lot tighter than it has been for quite some time. And despite consistent monthly gains in jobs, the number of job losses that are permanent is increasing as the virus shows few signs of going away anytime soon. According to the New York Times, the official number of unemployed people tells only a part of the story. The government uses an arguably narrow definition of unemployment for its statistics, counting only those who are temporarily laid off or who have looked for work in the past 4 weeks. People who are not working and haven't actively sought work for the last month, even if they want jobs, are considered out of the labor force and are not counted. Of the people not in the labor force, there is a group considered marginally attached to it, those who have looked for a job in the last year but not in the last 4 weeks. Within the marginally attached category, just over 1 million people say the reason they're not currently seeking work is because of a family or transportation issues, a number that has only fallen slightly since the crisis began. With a large number of schools switching to remote learning and many childcare programs are shut down, some parents had to make a choice between working a job or caring for children. I know that's a lot of what's behind my reason for working from the house right now. My stepdaughter's going to homeschool, and I need to be home to supervise. So I know I'm not alone. Not all areas of this economy were hit equally hard. If you've been listening to my podcast for a while, you'll know that the construction sector was down just 1 million jobs in April, where it had been in February, but has gained back at least 400,000 of those jobs. Leisure and hospitality, on the other hand, has lost over 8 million jobs in the same time and is still close to 4 million jobs below pre-pandemic levels. And we're not out of the woods just yet. Job numbers could worsen, especially if cases rise significantly or restaurants and other businesses are forced to shut down again as the weather gets colder. With the presidential election looming, how Americans are personally experiencing these trends probably will affect the choices that they make in November. So here we are in month 8 of this pandemic. It's still pervasive across the country. And of course, our president, our first lady, and an ever-growing number of government officials have tested positive for the virus. Numbers are increasing in New York again, and whatever is going on in Florida is happening. But I still hear people talk about a recovery. But what makes a recession is the initial economic pain, whatever its source, and where it transmits broadly to affect nearly every industry and drive millions of people not into newer and faster growing sectors, but into the roles of the unemployed. The challenge for economic policymakers is not to prevent these structural adjustments. It's to ensure that as public health concerns wane, there is strong enough demand for goods and services across the economy that even as some jobs disappear forever, new ones are being created, and the pain is short-lived. The last 2 recessions were followed by jobless recoveries, in which it took years for that process to play out. So what we really need to start looking for is new job growth, and that's going to be the true indication that we're really on the road to a recovery. In our next segment, I'm going to get into what the recovery looks like and what we can anticipate in the future. So right now I'm going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to look at our recovery. So stick around. And if you wait until the end of the show, I'm going to give you a little bit of a break and we're going to talk about the top 10 Halloween candy. So stick around.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us. Our last segment, we talked about what got us into the current state of the economy. Let's look towards the future. The coronavirus recession hit the U.S. hard and fast, shrinking the economy 32.9% in the second quarter alone. But there are signs that point to a recovery. Unemployment, while still absolutely abysmal, is starting to get better. And the stock market, despite a recent rough patch, is up overall since it crashed hard in February. A few financial experts have even declared the end of the coronavirus recession may be at hand, while Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, warns that employment and economic health remain well below their pre-pandemic levels and that more aid is needed. Economists sometimes discuss recoveries in terms of line graphs that look like letters. You've probably heard of V, W, or K, depending on how quick and sustained they are. If you watched the presidential debate circus last week, the president and former vice president Joe Biden disagreed on the shape of the economy, with Trump claiming that the recovery is in a V shape and Biden suggesting that it's a K shape. So, what's the difference? Think of it this way. If you charted out U.S. GDP growth over time, which shape would you see? A V-shaped recovery is the type of economic recession and recovery that resembles a V shape in charting. Duh. Specifically, a V-shaped recovery represents the shape of a chart of economic measures economists create when examining recessions and recoveries. A V-shaped recovery involves a sharp rise back to a previous peak after a sharp decline in these metrics. Such recoveries are generally spurred by a significant shift in economic activity caused by a rapid readjustment of consumer demand and business investment spending. Because of the rapid adjustment of the economy and the quick recovery in major aggregate metrics of macroeconomic performance, a V-shaped recovery can be thought of the best-case scenario once an economy has hit a recession. So it makes sense as to why a sitting president would want to see a V-shaped economy. Peter Atwater, an adjunct lecturer in economics at the economics department at William and Mary University, also feels that the U.S. economy is past the point of the V-shape. It's very clear divergence in experience from the bottom as it is on the top. There's stacked inequity for those on the bottom versus stacked privilege for those on the top, cutting across race, gender, education, and any of the demographic classification. There's a U-shaped recovery where things fall and then they take a long time at a low level and then they rise. But I don't see that happening in this case because if you look at just the stock market, you look at the rise in income of Jeff Bezos, of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, they've all profited off of the recovery. So to say that it's a U shape, I think is far-fetched. There's also a W shape, which goes up and down, up and down. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've all gone up. There's an L shape, which means that we don't recover, and a J shape, which means that we recover a little bit, then we decline, then we go back up. But then there's the K-shape, and I think this is the most applicable to the situation we find ourselves in. We've got one leg that goes up and one leg that goes down. The K-shape is a lot more nuanced. It's not talking about the headline GDP growth. It's talking about how different groups inside the economy are recovering. Worries of a K-shaped recovery are growing in the alphabet-obsessed economics profession that would entail continued growth, but split sharply between industries and economic groups. It's a scenario where big box retail and Wall Street banks benefit and mom and pop restaurants and shops and other service profession workers lag. And I mean, that sounds really familiar. They're not readily visible in the GDP numbers for the next several quarters that will look gaudy in historical term. The uneven benefits of the recovery pose longer-term risks for the national economic health. The K-shaped recovery is just a reiteration of what we call the bifurcation of the economy during the Great Financial Crisis. It's about growing inequalities since the early 1980s across the country and the economy. When we talk K, the upper path of the K is clearly financial markets, and the lower path is the real economy. And these two are separated. So it's really what's the difference between Wall Street and Main Street. Indeed, one of the simplest ways to envision the current K pattern is by looking at the meteoric surge of the stock market since late March compared to the rest of the economy. While the market soared to new highs, GDP plunged at its most ever annualized rates, unemployment was falling, and we still really haven't seen a reduction in the unemployment rate, as I talked about in my last segment. That in and of itself exacerbates inequality at a time when 52% of stocks and mutual funds are owned by the top 1% of earners. In addition, many so-called white-collar workers have been able to either transition to working from home or they've returned to an office with new safety precautions in place. That's in stark contrast to restaurant servers and hotel employees, for example, whose industries have continued to decline. It's much easier for me as a financial planner to work from home. My husband has a desk job and is able to go back to work with increased safety protocols. But my sister Jody, who works in a factory, had to spend time off of work. And neither my husband nor myself ever had to miss work because of the pandemic. According to a June 2020 report, 42% of the U.S. labor force, about 70 million people, were working from home, while 26% were continuing to work on site. The remaining 33% were not working. While many of those working from home will eventually return to the workplace, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta projects the number of full-time employees who work from home at least one day a week will nearly triple relative to 2019, when only about 10% of workers enjoyed that benefit. They project that more than 20% of workers will work 2 or more days a week from home going forward. The shift to working from home is also likely to affect the housing market. People who can work from home may move out of cities into suburban and rural areas to save on housing costs. That could potentially increase the available housing supply in cities and drive rents downwards. But the catch is it might also trigger local rent control exceptions. So in the end, it's not just about asset ownership, it's the nature of those assets. The stock market gains have been largely the result of a handful of stocks, excluding newcomer Salesforce.com. Apple, Microsoft, and Home Depot have contributed more points to the Dow Jones Industrial Average this year than the other 27 stocks in the index combined. That's why Wall Street, when looking for the proper letter, V, W, U, or whatever, is beginning to see K is more of a possibility. The K-shaped narrative is gaining traction as the tale of two recoveries conforms well with the ongoing outperformance of risk assets and real estate, while frontline service sector jobs risk permanent elimination. The dominating stocks, in fact, help tell a story about a shifting economy that is leaving behind those with less access to technology that will shape the recovery. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has bemoaned the momentum that lower earners have just begun to see prior to the pandemic. That's one of the reasons the central bank has adopted a major policy shift in which will allow inflation to run above the Fed's 2% goal for a period of time after it has run below the mark. More than just a philosophical statement about inflation, codifying the approach allows the Fed to keep interest rates low, even after the jobless rate drops below what had once been considered full employment. Fed officials believe that keeping policy loose when the unemployment rate hit a 50-year low over the past year helped contribute to the wider distribution of income gains and should be the approach going forward. The economy added 661,000 jobs in September, which is a marked increase in the pace after the August jobs report said that 1.4 million jobs were added. The September report noted that the unemployment rate dropped 0.5% to 7.9%, an abysmal rate that is unlikely to seriously rebound anytime soon. In this context, it means that the workforce is still 10 million jobs short of the 22 million loss because of the coronavirus. And it should be noted that 26 million Americans, particularly blue-collar workers in key electoral states, are on some form of unemployment insurance. The recovery may have initially rebounded a bit better than expected, but it disproportionately favored higher wage workers, and it's stalling out. The country has certainly not rounded the corner. Many of the protections put in place early in the pandemic, such as the $600 federal unemployment enhancement and the Paycheck Protection Program, have dried up. Despite nearly 30 million U.S. workers being out of work, food insecurity now affects an estimated 29 million U.S. adults. And again, the president is still receiving treatment for COVID, and at the time of this recording is expected to leave Walter Reed Hospital at any second. His perceived incapacity is scary for many investors. A potential resurgence of cases and a lack of fiscal aid are the biggest near-term risks until a vaccine is widely available. The most recent measure of Bloomberg Consumer Comfort Index edged down from a 5-month high through it's well below its pre-pandemic level. Meanwhile, data from OpenTable, a restaurant booking platform, showed reservations improved slightly last week, but it remained 42% below year-ago levels. With the initial boost from business reopenings long past and few new efforts being introduced to stem the spread of the virus, the economy is showing only gradual improvement each week, with little hope of reaching typical levels anytime soon. And while the third quarter gross domestic product will likely show a record gain in the period, much of that reflects the earlier reopenings. And the fourth quarter is expected to be significantly slower. Moreover, the broader economy and labor market and sectors reliant on in-person interaction still have a very long way to go, even as some indicators such as overall retail sales and home sales are now above pre-pandemic levels. The U.S. economy faces risks from a potential resurgence of the coronavirus pandemic and from the failure of Congress to provide additional financial support for struggling individuals and businesses. That judgment emerges from a survey released Monday by the National Association of Business Economics of 52 forecasters that were polled last month. Among the forecasters, 55% said they regarded a second wave of COVID cases as the most serious threat. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention revised its guidance on Monday to say that the coronavirus can linger in the air from minutes to hours. So we're looking at some extended infectious time, and we're just learning more about this pandemic as the days go on. So we don't even know the half of it, I really feel. I mean, on the brighter side, Johnson Redbook's weekly measure of retail same-store sales increased, surpassing year-ago levels for the second consecutive week. And the housing market continues to boom. Record low mortgage rates have helped fuel demand, with a measure of mortgage application for purchases falling slightly from its highest level more than 11 years ago. Well, after the last two segments, I really feel like we need some good news. And I'm going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to go over the top 10 best Halloween candies. So you've eaten your vegetables. Now it's time for dessert. Stick around.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
This has been a pretty COVID-centric episode. The president has COVID, the way the pandemic has changed the economy, and if and how we can ever recover. So I want to end this episode on a lighter note. As you may have guessed, fall is my favorite season. I have my apple candle burning, drank a few cups of pumpkin spice coffee, and I'm waiting for the Alabama heat to break. Oh, and the Crimson Tide are too, and they look amazing. What's more fall than Halloween? Well, we know this year's going to be way different for obvious reasons, but the 31st of October happens every year. So let's celebrate in the most socially distanced way possible with my top 10 favorite Halloween candy of all time. Okay, so I know a couple episodes ago I did a top 10 of the best fitness apps, and this is kind of going in a different way, but we all have to have an opinion on this. So we'll start off at number 10. And at number 10, I've got M&M's. This is one of my favorite candies of all time. And if it were just a top 10 list of candy, this would be a lot closer to number 1. But the Halloween packs are a little small, and you don't get all the fun flavors like pretzel and caramel, but you really only get the classic regular chocolate and peanut, which I'm not a fan. So it's at number 10. M&M's, good solid candy. At number 9 is the Hershey chocolate. When in doubt, go for one of the most iconic candies of all time, also known as the Great American Chocolate Bar. Fun fact, the first bar was sold way back in 1900. Honestly, I prefer the crackle, and I've only ever seen this in the mini mixes. I did read in preparation for this episode that full bars of crackle were sold up until about 2008, but I never saw one. So I really love the Halloween mixes, and I never turned down the special dark chocolate either. At number 8, I've got Tootsie Roll Pops. There's something that's so classic about the Tootsie Roll Pop. When I was a kid, there was an iconic commercial where a little boy goes up to an owl and asks, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? And since then, I know I tried to figure it out, and probably millions of other kids. The owl said it was 3, but a group of engineering students from Purdue University reported that its licking machine, which was modeled after the human tongue, took an average of 364 licks to get to the center. The University of Michigan reported 411 licks in a similar study. Personally, I just could never get to the center without biting, but I have a short attention span. Back to the fun stuff. Lollipops in general are a great treat based on how long they last, and Tootsie Roll Pops have a lot of gusto. One thing that is not so great about them is their little wrapper that can fall off, but if you look for the one with the star, then that means that you're the winner. I don't know what you ever win, but that was the word on the street when I was a kid. At number 7, I've got Three Musketeers. I love the Three Musketeers. I take the chocolate off and then eat the inside. Is that an overshare? I don't know if this is a safe space, but the Three Musketeers got its name because it used to come in 3 flavors: vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. I didn't know that. But we now know this famous bar from the 1930s in its standard chocolate form. For those who might be counting calories, this treat boasts that it has 45% less fat than other chocolate bars. Also, while it's kind of simple, it's really delicious. Sometimes you just want some chocolate without all the fuss. At number 6, I've got Pop Rocks. Pop Rocks are awesome. And don't believe the myth. Created in the 70s, these fizzy candies are like no other. They're also a Halloween rarity, so you'll be creative if you choose to throw these in pillowcases and plastic pumpkins this year. These candies are made by mixing ingredients into a syrup and then exposing the syrup to pressurized carbon dioxide gas before cooling. When you put them in your mouth, the gas dissolves and causes the fun pop and crackle effect. Probably the first urban legend I ever heard as a kid was that Mikey from Life cereal commercials died from eating Pop Rocks and drinking soda. Of course, this isn't true. And thousands of people have tried this, and there are countless videos on YouTube. So if you're curious, look it up. Number 5 is I have Twizzlers. And I just learned that this is a controversial pick. Twizzlers and Red Vines are my go-to movie candy. And the Halloween version packs are just right for a little quick jolt of sugar. Some misguided people, like the rest of my family, think they're a little waxy. But people love them. I'm not alone. They're part of Floyd Mayweather's pre-fight diet, and U.S. women's soccer star Sydney Leroux has a thing for them too. They're also a favorite with long-distance runners as a quick source of energy. So healthy people eat them too. At number 4, I've got Laffy Taffy and Nerds. When I was in law school, our registrar's office would have a basket full of Laffy Taffy and Nerds for people just to stop by and pick up as the day went on. It was again, for a quick jolt of sugar, while after 4 hours studying was amazing. I like the banana and the grape Laffy Taffy, and Nerds are really just colorful and fun. I think they're like Pop Rocks without the fizz. Nerds candy came out in 1983 and were sold by Nestle. They were small, irregularly shaped pieces of candy that came in 2 different flavors in each box. There were a variety of flavors and would become one of the world's most popular candies of all time. In my mind, they are the epitome of 80s candies. At number 3, I have Snickers. This was definitely the number 1 candy in my house when I was a kid. I had to pay a Snickers tax to my dad every Halloween, giving him at least 3 bars from my Halloween haul. One of the earliest candy bar sensations that is still going incredibly strong today. Mars pumps out about 15 million of the small candy bars a day. The chocolate bar with a peanut, caramel, and nougat filling has been satisfying the hunger of candy lovers for 90 years. Whether it's enjoyed in the fun-sized version by kids at Halloween or claiming a Guinness World Record for the largest candy bar, there's no denying that Snickers is one of the most popular candy bars in the world. With such a long legacy, the candy bar has seen its shares of highs and lows, and recently has come under fire more than once for its high-calorie content. But maybe that's where they get the tagline that Snickers really satisfies, because it's like your whole day's worth of calories. So here's a fun fact. We all know Halloween falls on the 31st. And many years it falls on the day of the week that aren't really party-friendly. In 2019, the 31st was on a Thursday. It's not the worst day, but it's not as good as Saturday, which it is this year, but I don't know how many communities are going to do trick-or-treating. So In 2019, Snickers joined a movement to officially make Halloween the last Saturday in October. Snickers didn't merely say they thought it was a good idea to change the date of Halloween, but actually gave an incentive to do so. A Thursday Halloween? Not satisfying, read a tweet from Snickers. Halloween on the last Saturday of October? Satisfying. If the federal government makes it official, we will offer 1 million free Snickers to America. And I don't think that happened, but I'm actually okay with that. I think that's probably a pretty good idea. But we'll see what happens. I know this year is going to be weird, so. At number 2, I've got Kit Kat. I reach for Kit Kats first in a bowl of candy. I've tried the random Japanese and the new American flavors. Like wasabi is surprisingly refreshing, but apple pie, not so much. So just to prove its prowess as the world leader in Kit Kat innovation, Japan came out with a bakeable Kit Kat bar last year. They're essentially mini bars covered in dough and infused with flavors like cheesecake and pudding. They caused quite a stir when they came out in Japan, and apparently can be found in select ethnic food stores statewide. One reviewer for LA Weekly gave them a thumbs up, saying they tasted like a sweet chocolate biscuit. So if anybody knows where I can find these close to my home in Montgomery, Alabama, hit me up on Twitter because I'm going to need some of these. At number 1, we have the classic Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, the king of candy. My family actually has fistfights over Reese's. When I first started dating my husband, he would tell me that he loved me almost as much as Reese's. He's since revised that statement because with age comes wisdom, but Reese's may be a close second to me. Every year, Reese's makes enough peanut butter cups to feed 1 cup to everybody in the US, Africa, Europe, Japan, Australia, India, and China. The Hershey Company has taken America's Halloween candy market by storm in recent years, accounting for almost half of all consumer expenditure on regular-sized chocolate candies. Reese's is America's best-selling brand when it comes to snack-size candy. So there you have it, the top 10. I have an honorable mention with Twix. It's a great candy. It's always enjoyable, but I just don't love the Halloween size format. To me, it loses something there. And no list of the best candy would be complete without the worst Halloween candy. While doing research for this podcast, I found out that circus peanuts are on the list. First, I didn't know that there are people who are depraved enough to give circus peanuts to small children trying to enjoy a fall night of costumes. Seriously? My sweet, precious Aunt Betty loved circus peanuts. May she rest in peace. And I loved her in spite of it. But without a doubt, the absolute worst Halloween candy in the history of Halloween and the history of candy is candy corn. Each kernel has 3 colors, about 7 calories, and a lot of sugar. That's 7 calories that could go towards an M&M. In a bridge too far, there's now a candy corn beer. That's right, if you don't like eating candy corn, now you can just opt to drink the Halloween sensation. Wisconsin's West Alien Brewing Company rolled out their candy corn cream ale, which was brewed to smell and taste like candy corn, with notes of vanilla and cream. Not overly sweet and very well balanced, the company posted on Instagram. This beer will take you back to your childhood and also remind you, hey, I'm really drinking a beer. Thanks, but no thanks. So I hope you have a great Halloween, but I'm sure we'll have quite a few podcasts between now and Halloween. So thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. Find us on Twitter at GSMC Financial, and hit me up if you've got any questions, concerns, comments, opinions on candy corn. I'm here for you. Find us on your favorite podcast app and give us a 5-star review because that'll help us. So until next time, wash your hands and wear your mask. See ya.
You've been listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's podcast.